Before we begin, take a deep breath and let the noise of the modern world fade away. Imagine an Earth before roads, before walls, before history had a name. The wind moved freely across plains of ice and stone, untouched by the hum of machines or the echo of cities. The stars shone brighter then, casting their cold light over a world ruled by endurance. Across those endless horizons walked our ancestors, people shaped by the earth itself. They hunted beneath frozen skies, gathered fire from stone, and built their lives on instinct and strength. Every breath was survival, every dawn a victory. They were not yet divided by nations or languages, only bound by the will to live. For thousands of generations, they learned the rhythm of the wild, the dance of fire, storm, and hunger. Before we go deeper into their world, make sure you're subscribed and your notifications are on, because stories like this, stories that remind us where we came from, deserve to live again. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Let's see how far humanity's oldest memory still reaches, as we return to that forgotten age when the world was young and every heartbeat echoed through the ice. The world was young, yet already old enough to forget the warmth. Vast glaciers pressed their white weight upon the continents, grinding mountains into dust. The air shimmered with cold, the kind that bit through fur and bone alike. Winds howled through valleys carved by centuries of ice, carrying no sound of laughter or speech, only the echo of storms and the heavy tread of creatures built to endure them. Across this frozen earth, the mammoth herds moved like drifting continents of muscle and hair, their tusks gleaming pale under a sun that offered no comfort. In this age before memory, before stories, before names, another kind of being walked among them. They were human, though not as we are. Their arms were thick, their chests broad, their stride purposeful and heavy. Each step left a print deeper than snow could swallow. These were the Neanderthals, children of the ice, masters of endurance. Born from a world that demanded strength over grace. For hundreds of thousands of years, they had lived here, in the places the cold refused to yield. Their days began and ended with the struggle to stay alive. Every movement had purpose: cutting, scraping, shaping, hunting. Their homes were caves or wind-sheltered ledges where the smoke of their fires blackened the ceilings over generations. They carried the knowledge of stone, and that knowledge was enough. With flakes of flint and shafts of bone, they carved tools sharp as thought. With fire, they pushed back the night. Theirs was a life stripped to its essentials: food, warmth, shelter, kin. Yet in the quiet moments between storms, when the wind calmed and the mammoths moved in the distance, they must have felt something else. Something unspoken. The weight of being alive in a world that could erase them with a single season. They had no word for beauty, yet they saw it in the shimmer of frost, in the glow of embers, in the first light touching a field of snow. This was not a story of progress or conquest. It was balance. Every death fed another life. Every fire that burned bright consumed the wood of a long-dead tree. For the Neanderthal, survival was not victory, it was belonging. They were not outsiders in nature. They were its voice, its pulse, its breath. Long before our kind ever set foot upon these frozen plains, they ruled the silence. For 300,000 years, they endured storms that would have killed us in days. Theirs was an empire of frost and patience, and though their names would never be written, their story began here in the world before memory, beneath the pale light of a sun that barely remembered how to rise. They came into the world beneath a sky of ice, their first breath steaming in the cold air like a promise to endure. Every newborn entered a lesson written not in words, but in frost. The air was thin, the ground hard, and mercy was a stranger. Yet they thrived. Where others would have frozen, they adapted. Their bones thickened, their chests broadened, their blood moved slower and heavier, carrying warmth where warmth refused to stay. They were not merely surviving the cold, they were shaped by it, sculpted until even the blizzards seemed to know their outlines. The Ice Age did not allow weakness. Every creature that walked this earth paid a price to remain here. The Neanderthal learned that early. Their bodies were built for strength, not speed, their muscles dense, and their hands powerful enough to crush stone flakes into shape. Each movement carried purpose. Each heartbeat was a victory over the cold that wanted them gone. They were the children of endurance, born from centuries of adaptation. The cold was not only an enemy, it was a teacher. It taught silence, patience, calculation. In a world where every meal required effort, where every mistake could mean death, instinct became wisdom. They knew how to read the snow by touch, how to sense the shifting wind that warned of a coming storm. Their eyes, deep and heavy-browed, could see through the dim light of a world that barely thawed. Their lungs were vast, filling with air that burned but sustained them all the same. And so their lives moved to the rhythm of the earth's breath. When the mammoths roamed near, the tribes followed, tracing migrations older than their own bloodlines. When the herds vanished into the blizzards, they waited, rationing, repairing, surviving on memory and skill. The seasons had no sympathy, only order, and the Neanderthals learned to obey it. They were not a people of dreams or kingdoms. They built no walls, carved no idols, left behind no temples of stone. Their temple was the earth itself, their cathedral the cave, their prayer the sound of fire cracking against the cold. Every scar on their hands was a record of their devotion to life. For thousands of generations, they lived this way, unmoving yet undefeated, fragile yet eternal. To the Ice Age, they were not intruders but heirs. The cold did not kill them. It raised them, fed them, and molded them into something the world would never see again. Humans who could call the frost home. Deep within the stone heart of the earth, warmth flickers against the cold. The Ice Age world outside groans beneath snow and silence, but inside the caves, something extraordinary begins to glow. Sparks leap from flint to tinder, and for the first time, darkness trembles. Fire, alive, breathing, untamed, answers the hands that summon it. It hisses, cracks, and roars softly, painting the walls with color that has never existed before. For the Neanderthal, this was no simple flame. It was the heartbeat of life itself. They had learned to call upon the most sacred force the world could offer. Fire meant survival. It meant cooked meat instead of raw flesh, safety from the beasts that prowled in the black, and warmth when the sky froze over for months at a time. It was a miracle they could make again and again, coaxing light from stone and patience. And once born, the flame demanded devotion. They fed it with dry wood, guarded it against the wind, and carried its embers wrapped in bark from one camp to the next. Without it, they were nothing. With it, they could defy the Ice Age itself. The cave became their sanctuary. Within its curved walls, the wind could not reach them. Shadows danced like living spirits across the rock, stretching and bending with every movement of the fire. In that flickering glow, warmth wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It gathered them together, closed the distance between survival and belonging. They sat in silence, their faces lit by gold and red, eyes reflecting the same ancient light that still burns in ours. The fire gave them more than heat. It offered thought. In its glow, they began to watch, to wonder, to dream without knowing what dreaming was. They may not have spoken in stories, but the rhythm of the flames told one the endless struggle between light and dark, life and death. Every crackle was a memory of the hunt, every spark a fragment of the future. Outside, the blizzard howled without pity, erasing tracks and swallowing the cries of beasts. But in the cave, something had changed forever. Humanity, though still primitive, still fragile, had found its first symbol of control. Fire was no longer a wild thing to be feared, it was a companion, a promise, a weapon against the endless night. It was the first act of rebellion against a world that wanted them cold and silent. And from that small circle of warmth, civilization, in its faintest ember, had begun to stir. In a world without metal or machines, survival was born from the meeting of stone and will. Somewhere beneath the pale winter sun, Hands worked in silence, shaping the future, one spark at a time. A single rock, struck with precision, split into shining fragments. Each shard carried the promise of life, edges sharp enough to skin a beast, carve a branch, or pierce a heart. To those who made them, these were not mere tools. They were extensions of thought, of instinct, refined into art. The Neanderthal's mind was steady and deliberate. Every strike required judgment, every flake a calculation older than language itself. The rhythm of stone echoed across generations, from parent to child, a quiet song of knowledge passed through muscle memory. Flint, obsidian, and quartz became sacred to them, the holy trinity of their existence. They learned to read a rock the way we might read a page, its lines, its veins, its potential hidden within. With patience and repetition, they coaxed form from raw material, crafting blades that shimmered under the cold light of dawn. The makers of stone were not artists by intent, yet their work carried beauty. Edges curved perfectly to fit the hand, symmetry born not from vanity but necessity. A well-made tool could mean the difference between life and hunger, between a clean cut and a shattered wrist. In the harsh rhythm of the Ice Age, mastery was not luxury, it was law. The fragments of their labor still survive, buried in the soil, their edges still sharp after 50,000 years. Each piece tells a story without words, a record of intelligence that needed no alphabet. The shape of a hand axe reveals the shape of a mind that planned ahead, foresaw outcomes, and adapted. In those flakes of flint lies proof that thought itself was once carved from stone. For the Neanderthal, every tool held memory. A blade might be used for years, repaired, resharpened, carried across valleys and passed down through generations. To discard one was to discard experience. In a sense, these tools became the first form of inheritance, a continuity of survival etched in mineral and motion. As their fires burned low and the night stretched endless across the ice, the sound of stone striking stone remained the heartbeat of their existence. It was rhythm, creation, and defiance all at once. With each deliberate strike, they declared to the cold and the dark that they were still here, still enduring, still shaping a world that refused to yield. The hunt begins long before the chase. It starts in silence, in the reading of the wind, in the patient study of tracks pressed deep into snow. Across the frozen plains of an unforgiving world, the Neanderthals move as one. Their world is ruled by giants, mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, bison, larger than houses, and survival depends on their ability to bring one of these titans down. Each winter repeats the same ancient ritual: hunger, courage, and blood. The cold sharpens every sense. Breath turns to clouds that vanish as quickly as they form. The earth trembles faintly with the movements of distant herds, vibrations that travel through the soles of their feet long before their eyes can see the shapes. To hunt a creature 10 times one's weight is to court death, yet the Neanderthal understands balance. They do not kill for sport or glory. Each life taken feeds the fire, the family, the future. Every spear thrown carries not ambition, but necessity. Preparation is everything. The tips of their weapons are hardened by fire, their shafts straightened by patient hands. Flint points gleam like glass in the pale light. They know the rhythm of the herd, the way wind direction can betray them, the way silence must be held even when fear presses like ice against the skin. When the time comes, they move without sound, an ancient choreography of instinct and trust. The first throw cuts through the air with a sound that breaks the stillness. The giant bellows, a sound that shakes the heart. Chaos follows. Snow erupts beneath pounding hooves. The air fills with the deep, thunderous music of survival. Some hunters fall. Some wounds never heal. Yet when the beast finally collapses, the land itself seems to exhale. Around its fallen body, they gather not in celebration but in reverence. They understand what it means to take life from the earth. For days, they will live on this kill. Every part of the animal will serve a purpose: meat for the fires, hide for shelter, bone for tools, sinew for binding. Nothing is wasted, nothing forgotten. The hunt is not simply about feeding the body, it feeds the bond between them. Around the fire that night, they will eat in silence, warmed by the heat of shared survival. In a world ruled by cold and giants, unity is their greatest weapon. Without it, the ice wins. With it, they endure. Theirs is a strength not born from dominance, but from harmony, a fragile, fleeting balance between hunter and hunted, written in snow and sealed in blood. Outside, the wind screams across the frozen plains, tearing through the trees and scouring the snow until it hardens like glass. But deep within the caves, a gentler world flickers to life. Fire breathes softly against the stone, its light painting the walls in shades of gold and red. Around that fragile circle of warmth, the Neanderthals gather, their heavy faces illuminated by a glow that feels older than time. The storm cannot reach them here. Inside, they are safe, at least for the night. The bond of firelight is more than comfort. It is the thread that ties them together. The warmth they share is not just physical but ancestral, a silent agreement between generations that survival is a collective act. In the presence of flame, fear loses its shape. The children, pressed close to their mothers, drift between waking and dreams. The adults sit quietly, their eyes reflecting the dance of light, minds tracing memories of hunts, of the dead, of the world beyond the cave's mouth. No one speaks, yet everything is said. The fire becomes their heart, pulsing with rhythm and meaning. Each crackle is a breath, each spark a reminder of how fragile life remains. Outside, death rules the landscape. Inside, life insists on continuing. The cave becomes more than shelter. It becomes a world within a world, a fragile bubble of warmth in an endless ocean of cold. And within that circle, something deeply human begins to take shape. In this light, tenderness exists. A hand rests on a shoulder, a quiet sharing of meat, a soft sound made to calm a restless child. These small gestures, repeated over thousands of years, form the first language of love. They do not build cities or carve monuments, but what they create instead is far more enduring, the pattern of care that will one day define humanity itself. The fire consumes wood, the wood becomes smoke, and the smoke rises toward cracks in the ceiling where the stars beyond cannot be seen. Yet even unseen, the stars remain. The Neanderthals do not know the names of constellations, but they know the rhythm of the earth, the cycle of hunger and hope. They understand that every spark must be guarded, every ember fed, or the cold will reclaim what warmth has won. As the night deepens, the wind continues to howl, but its power fades at the edge of the firelight. Inside, the circle holds strong. In the glow of that shared flame, surrounded by stone and shadow, they are not just surviving, they are belonging. And as long as the fire burns, they are not alone. The land stretched wide and merciless beneath the frozen sky, a place where the balance of life hung by a thread of instinct. The Neanderthals were not alone here. The valleys they hunted and the caves they claimed belonged to others too, creatures carved by the same brutal hand of nature. Saber-toothed cats moved like whispers through the fog, their eyes twin embers of hunger. Wolves circled at the edges of the firelight, patient and clever, waiting for weakness. Cave bears ruled the same shelters humans sought, ancient lords of stone and silence. To live in this world was to share it with death. Every step beyond the safety of the cave carried a question: who would claim the next meal, and who would become it? The Neanderthal understood this truth not as fear, but as law. They knew the scent of danger as well as they knew the scent of fire. Their ears learned to read the silence between the winds, the faint rhythm of padded paws in the snow. They did not dominate the earth, they negotiated with it daily, and survival was the price of admission. Each dawn was a contest written in blood and endurance. The predators they faced were not mindless beasts but masters of their craft, each adapted perfectly to this frozen stage. The cats struck from shadows, their power explosive and precise. Wolves hunted in families, coordinated by instinct as deep as the cold. Even the ravens followed the trails of the living, patient witnesses to the endless cycle of hunger. Yet in this cruel landscape, the Neanderthal held their ground. They learned to move as the predators did, slow, deliberate, unseen until it was too late. Their spears were their fangs, their unity their pack. They claimed victories not through strength alone, but through understanding the rhythm of the wild. For them, survival was not conquest but coexistence. Every creature that fell by their hand was honored, every encounter remembered. When the snow settled and the wind howled through the bones of the earth, the land seemed to breathe with teeth and claws. Every shadow could kill, but every heartbeat was defiance. In this world of predators, the Neanderthal stood among equals, neither king nor prey, but a creature forged in the same crucible of necessity. And beneath the endless winter sky, surrounded by eyes that gleamed from the dark, they became what the world demanded, strong, cunning, and unyielding as the ice itself. In a world ruled by silence, communication was born from motion. The Neanderthals did not speak in long streams of words. Their voices were low, heavy with breath, shaped more by rhythm than language. But what their tongues could not express, their hands could. A glance carried meaning, a shift of the shoulders could command. The flicker of a hand across the firelight could mean safety or danger, hunger or comfort. They spoke through presence, through the shared pulse of understanding that passed between them like wind through grass. Theirs was a language older than sound. Long before words carved the air, gesture carried thought. A finger pressed to the lips could hold a hunt in perfect stillness. The movement of a head could direct a dozen eyes to the same prey. The tilt of a hand could calm a frightened child. Over generations, these gestures became as precise and subtle as any tongue that would come later. They needed no sentences, because their lives were bound by shared purpose. When every heartbeat might mean survival, there was no room for confusion. In the half-light of the cave, the hands told stories that words could not. They marked the memories of hunts, traced the shape of animals on stone, and carved meaning into the bones of the earth. Some gestures were ritual, sacred motions repeated around the fire, the first prayers made without speech. Their language was not written, yet it left traces everywhere. Every handprint pressed into ancient cave walls was a declaration: we were here, and we understood one another. Silence, to them, was not emptiness, it was connection. They listened, not just with ears, but with eyes and hearts. The world around them spoke in its own language, the creak of ice, the murmur of streams beneath frost, the low growl of predators in the night. To survive here, they had to join that conversation, to move as the earth moved. Their gestures were part of that great dialogue, a rhythm shared with nature itself. Through this unspoken language, they became more than hunters. They became a people bound by empathy and intuition. Every glance, every movement, every touch was an act of meaning. And in that ancient silence, long before speech was born, the essence of humanity already existed. It was not the voice that made them human. It was the understanding between them, the silent, sacred language of hands. For a few precious months each year, the world softened. The frozen plains cracked open, and water once trapped in ice began to move again. Rivers came alive, their currents glittering beneath the pale northern sun. Meadows bloomed where snow had ruled for months, filling the air with the scent of damp earth and the hum of life returning. For the Neanderthals, this was the brief miracle they waited for through the endless dark of winter, the season of plenty. The change came slowly, like a promise fulfilled. The herds returned first, their hooves stirring the thawed soil. Reindeer, bison, and mammoth moved northward, following the green trail of new grass. Birds screamed across the sky, painting it with movement and song. Streams once silent beneath the ice now teemed with silver flashes of salmon, leaping toward their spawning grounds. Every corner of the land seemed alive again, and for a moment, even the cold loosened its grip. In this fragile window of warmth, survival transformed from endurance to abundance. The hunts grew easier, the fires burned brighter, and bellies filled with food enough to forget hunger. The Neanderthals gathered by the rivers, their spears striking with precision, each motion learned through generations of repetition. Fish were caught in woven traps or struck cleanly from the water's surface. The air was filled with the smell of smoke, cooked meat, and the laughter of children, sounds rare enough to feel sacred. But even in these golden days, there lingered the quiet understanding that it would not last. The seasons moved in circles, not lines. The Neanderthals had no calendar, yet they felt time as deeply as the pulse beneath their skin. The sun rose higher now, but they knew it would soon fall again. Every berry picked, every piece of meat dried over the fire, was not just for the present, it was for the cold that waited beyond the horizon. Their lives followed the rhythm of the earth, a rhythm written into their bones. In the warmth of summer, they repaired tools, strengthened shelters, and prepared for the long silence to come. Children played near the water's edge, throwing stones and mimicking the hunts they would one day join. The elders watched quietly, their faces carved with the lines of many winters. They had seen this cycle before and would see it again if the world allowed. Even in abundance, there was humility. They did not believe the land belonged to them. They belonged to it. The rivers that gave life could drown. The meadows that fed them could freeze in a single night. The Neanderthals lived not in defiance of nature, but in dialogue with it. They took what was offered and thanked the silence for its mercy. When the first chill returned to the air, when the wind began to taste of frost again, they did not fear it. They gathered what they could, strengthened their fires, and moved toward the caves that would shelter them once more. The laughter faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of preparation. The brief summer had given them what they needed, and now the earth asked for patience again. Life, to them, was not a battle against the elements, but a conversation with them. The cold spoke, the fire answered, and between them, humanity endured. The Neanderthals understood this truth better than any who came after. Nothing in this world is permanent. Not the warmth, not the cold, not even themselves. Yet for those fleeting seasons when the rivers danced and the meadows sang, they lived as kings in a kingdom of thawing ice content, connected, and unafraid of the dark that always followed. The wind carried a new scent across the plains, faint but unmistakable. It was the scent of change. For countless generations, the Neanderthals had walked this land alone, knowing every river bend, every hunting trail, every echo in the valley that belonged only to them. But one day, under the pale light of a warming sun, movement stirred on the horizon. Shapes unlike the herds appeared, upright, deliberate, human. Yet not their kind. At first they were shadows at a distance, slender figures crossing the grasslands with strange ease. Their steps were lighter, their pace quicker, their forms lean and long-limbed. They carried tools that gleamed differently in the light, smaller and more delicate than the heavy flint blades the Neanderthals had shaped for centuries. From the shelter of the hills, the old masters of this frozen world watched in silence, uncertain of what they were seeing. For hundreds of thousands of years, they had believed they were the only ones who had tamed the fire and shaped the stone, but the newcomers proved otherwise. Their fires burned brighter and moved more often, dotting the night like stars fallen to the earth. They did not stay in one place for long. They moved with purpose, as if following some map written in the sky. The Neanderthals, built for patience and endurance, could only wonder at such restless energy. The two kinds of human could not have been more different, yet they shared the same ancient blood. The Neanderthals were sculpted by ice, strong and deliberate, their power rooted in the earth. The newcomers were born of sun and distance, their bodies built for motion, their minds for invention. Where the Neanderthal struck stone with strength, the newcomers struck with speed and precision, shaping blades thin as leaves, light enough to carry across continents. The land that had once belonged to one people now whispered of two. Tracks overlapped in the mud. The same rivers were fished by different hands. For the first time, the old rhythm of life hesitated. The Neanderthals had never feared another species before. Wolves, lions, bears, all were understood, predictable, bound by the same rules. But these new humans were something else entirely. They were both familiar and foreign, reflections distorted by evolution's slow hand. From the high ground, the watchers remained still, their breath clouding in the evening chill. The strangers below sang softly around their fires, their voices rising and falling like the wind, a sound the Neanderthal world had never known. It wasn't a threat, but it was a reminder. The world was changing. In time, their paths would cross more closely. For now, there was only curiosity. No fear, no hatred. Just the quiet recognition that the earth was large enough for both, yet too small to stay unchanged. The Ice Age had taught the Neanderthals to endure the cold, but nothing had prepared them for this warmth of difference, this quiet intrusion of another kind of human beneath the same sky. As the sun sank behind the ridges and night reclaimed the plains, the newcomers' fires flickered on the horizon. They looked like a constellation that had fallen to the ground, spreading one spark at a time. And in that distant glow, the Neanderthals saw the faint outline of a future that would not belong to them. For the first time in the long, cold memory of the earth, two kinds of human faced each other across the same firelight. There was no thunder of battle, no clash of weapons, only silence filled with wonder. The Neanderthals, masters of ice and endurance, stood firm and watchful. The newcomers, lean and swift, approached with a kind of cautious confidence, their faces open, their hands unarmed. Between them burned the single thing that had shaped both species, the fire. Its glow painted their shadows across the stones, merging them into one. Curiosity bridged what instinct might have divided. The smoke from their shared flame curled upward into the dark, carrying the scent of roasted meat and unfamiliar spices. The Neanderthals studied the smaller tools of these strangers, the strange patterns carved into wood and bone. In return, the newcomers observed the heavy stone blades and the strength of the hands that wielded them. What words could not express, gestures replaced. A nod meant peace, an open palm meant offering. Fire was passed from one hearth to another, and in that moment, the distance between worlds seemed to vanish. For a while, the land knew a fragile harmony. The newcomers followed the rivers, gathering plants, setting snares, fishing in places where ice had long melted. The Neanderthals hunted in the high valleys and deep forests, where their strength and memory guided them. Their paths crossed often, but not in conflict. Instead, there were small exchanges, the sharing of warmth, of meat, of skill. A group of one would leave a fire burning for the other to find. Sometimes the remains of a hunt would be left untouched, as if both knew that survival was a debt to be repaid, not a prize to be hoarded. It was a rare season of balance, perhaps the only time in history when the two branches of humanity walked together beneath the same stars. Their fires dotted the plains like constellations on Earth, each one a reminder that cooperation, however brief, was possible even in a world built on hunger and ice. And yet, beneath this quiet exchange, the world itself was changing. The newcomers moved farther and faster, their camps spread along the rivers, their songs echoed through the hills. The Neanderthals watched and listened, sensing something they could not name, a tide beginning to turn. They had always believed the earth to be eternal and unchanging, but now the rhythm of life quickened in ways they could not follow. Still, for that short, shining moment, there was peace. The two fires, one ancient, one new, burned side by side. The night around them felt gentler, as if the earth itself paused to witness what it had never seen before and would never see again. Two species, born of the same spark, sharing warmth instead of war. And when dawn finally broke, painting the plains with pale gold, the smoke from their fires rose together into the sky and vanished as one. The traces of that meeting would fade with time, erased by wind and snow. But the memory of shared flame would remain, carried quietly in the blood of those who would come after. Proof that for a fleeting instant, humanity had once been whole. The world began to thaw. The air, once sharp as glass, softened. Winds that had howled across the plains for generations began to quiet, carrying the scent of soil instead of frost. The sky no longer stayed the pale color of bone. It deepened, bluer, warmer. alive. The age of ice was loosening its grip, and with every degree of warmth, the old world of the Neanderthals began to slip away. Glaciers that had once towered over valleys started to retreat, leaving behind rivers swollen with meltwater and plains speckled with new green. Mosses gave way to grass, grass to wildflowers, and wildflowers to the first forests. The land transformed in slow motion, as if the earth itself were exhaling after a long-held breath. What had been open tundra became walls of trees, dark and deep. For creatures built to chase herds across vast, empty spaces, this new world felt smaller, quieter, less certain. The great animals began to move north, following the cold they could not live without. Mammoths, bison, and woolly rhinoceros, creatures that had fed, clothed, and defined the Neanderthal, drifted away into lands of ice that still lingered beyond the horizon. Their absence was more than hunger. It was a hollowing of purpose. The rhythm of survival that had guided Neanderthals for hundreds of millennia began to falter. In the growing warmth, new life flourished, but not the kind they knew. Forests crawled into the open plains, hiding the sky beneath a ceiling of leaves. The air thickened with insects and the cries of strange birds. Streams that once froze solid now murmured year-round. The Neanderthals, shaped by a landscape of cold and distance, struggled to find their place in this gentler world. They were hunters of giants, but the giants were gone. The forests were alive, but their prey was smaller, quicker, harder to catch. Their tools still cut, their fires still burned, but the world no longer fit their hands. They were creatures of endurance, built for struggle against the cold, yet it was warmth that undid them. The same sun that promised life also brought change too fast to follow. In the comfort of the new earth, their mastery became their burden. They knew how to survive a frozen wasteland, but not how to live in a forest of abundance. The sky changed colors with the seasons now, not just shades of gray, but hues of gold, violet, and rain-soaked blue. To others it might have been beauty. To them, it was confusion. The horizon that had once stretched endless and pure was now crowded by trees. The paths of migration, once carved deep by mammoth feet, were overgrown with moss. The familiar was vanishing, swallowed by time and warmth. The Neanderthals watched this transformation from their caves and high ridges, silent witnesses to the end of their dominion. They did not know that they were fading, only that the world had grown strange. The cold that had shaped them, that had given them strength, was slipping away. And in its place came softness, a world where survival no longer rewarded endurance, but adaptability. Under the changing sky, their fires still burned, but smaller now, dimmer, surrounded by forests that whispered of things to come. The earth was moving on, and though they did not yet understand it, the Neanderthals were becoming part of its memory. The cold returned like a memory that refused to fade. The warmth that had softened the world was gone, swept away by a sudden, merciless winter. Snow fell earlier than expected, thick and heavy, burying the valleys before the last berries could be gathered. The rivers froze solid, sealing away the fish that had once filled their traps. The herds that roamed the plains vanished again into the horizon, chasing a sun that no longer gave enough heat to follow. This was the season the Neanderthals feared most, the hunger years, when firelight dimmed too quickly, when the meat dried up, when the bones of last season's hunt were cracked open for the faint taste of marrow. Every day became a quiet negotiation between body and earth, between hunger and endurance. The world that had once rewarded their strength now seemed to test it cruelly, pressing against them with the weight of its silence. Inside the caves, the fires burned low. The wood they had gathered during the brief summer was dwindling, and the smoke that curled upward no longer smelled of hope, only exhaustion. The nights were long beyond reason, stretching endlessly, one into another. The air outside carried the sound of the wind moving through empty valleys, a mournful voice calling across the snow. Inside, there was only breathing, the slow rhythm of a people too stubborn to surrender. Food grew scarce. The small animals that had taken refuge near the forests disappeared, their tracks covered in ice. The old trails once carved by mammoths were gone, erased by snowfall so deep that even memory failed to find them. They searched for what little could still be hunted, digging through snowdrifts, scavenging from what wolves and cats had left behind. Sometimes, they found carcasses frozen stiff in the plains, half buried by frost. These too became sustenance, flesh scraped from bone, fat rendered into firelight. The hunger carved more than the body, it hollowed the spirit. Faces grew thinner, movements slower. The Neanderthals had always known hardship. But this was different. It was not a single storm or season, it was a rhythm broken, the steady cycle of survival fractured beyond repair. Even the sky seemed to have turned against them, its light dim and its color pale as ash. Yet within the suffering, there was still resilience. The same hands that shaped stone now scraped ice from cave walls to drink. The same minds that tracked mammoths now found ways to trap hares and foxes. The fire never went out completely. No matter how little there was to burn, they kept it alive, because to let it die was to let the world win. Days bled into weeks, and still the cold showed no mercy. But the Neanderthals endured, as they always had. They had been shaped by ice, molded by scarcity, and though the world was changing faster than they could adapt, they clung to the one truth that had carried them through every storm. As long as breath filled their lungs and flame touched stone, they would not vanish into the snow. The hunger years would take many, but not all. The ones who remained would carry the memory forward, carved into bone, into blood, into the last light of their fading fire. The silence of the old world was broken by new voices. Across the valleys and along the rivers, smoke began to rise in unfamiliar places. The Neanderthals, once the undisputed masters of the frozen lands, now watched as the newcomers, the tall, slender humans from distant plains, spread like the slow approach of dawn. Their fires burned where none had been before. Their footprints overlapped the ancient paths of those who had come first. What began as scattered flickers of light soon became constellations upon the earth. These new humans moved differently. They did not linger near the same caves or follow the same herds for generations. Their camps were temporary, their shelters simple and quick to build. They carried less, traveled farther, and seemed to move with the rhythm of the seasons themselves. Where the Neanderthals were built for endurance, the newcomers were built for speed. They crossed rivers without hesitation, scaled ridges with ease, and hunted not with brute strength but with cunning and coordination. Their tools were smaller, sharper, crafted with precision that gave them reach beyond arm's length. With bow and atlatl, they could strike from a distance, swift, silent, deadly. As their numbers grew, the land itself began to shift under their presence. The valleys that had once echoed with the deep calls of mammoths now rang with song and laughter. The newcomers sang as they worked, their voices weaving through the forests like smoke. They painted the walls of caves with colors the Neanderthals had never imagined, reds and blacks and ochres forming shapes of animals, hunts, and dreams. Their firelight flickered against the stone, and in that glow, they seemed to speak not just to each other, but to the spirits of the earth. The Neanderthals watched from a distance. Curiosity lingered, but so did unease. The newcomers did not hunt the same way, nor did they share in the old respect for the hunt. Where Neanderthals took what was needed and moved with the herds, these strangers took more, storing their kills, drying their meat, planning for seasons ahead. Their strength was not in muscle but in numbers. Each season brought more of them, more camps, more fires, more voices rising into the night. For the first time, the Neanderthals felt small upon their own land. The territories that had sustained their families for countless generations began to shrink. The rivers where they once fished now carried the footprints of others. The caves where they had slept now held different fires. The earth that had always known their kind now carried new names, new footsteps, new laughter. Still, there was no war, only distance. The two kinds of human crossed paths less often now, not from hostility but from quiet displacement. The Neanderthals withdrew into the higher forests and colder ridges, the places the newcomers found less welcoming. There, the old ways endured a little longer, the heavy stone blades, the deep knowledge of the hunt, the rhythm of the fire. But even in those remote refuges, the The signs were clear. The world was changing faster than it ever had before. The strangers were not cruel, only inevitable. Their presence was the beginning of a new chapter in the story of life, a chapter that left little room for those who had come before. The Neanderthals had ruled the Ice Age for 300,000 years, but now the warmth favored others. And as their fires faded one by one, the land filled with a new kind of song, a song that spoke of expansion, of endurance, of a future that no longer belonged to them. The dawn was breaking, and its light was not theirs to keep. The world had grown sharper, colder, more unforgiving than memory could hold. Once, the rhythm of the hunt had been the pulse of life itself, steady, predictable, sacred. Now that rhythm was broken. The herds had thinned, the forests had crept into the plains, and the old trails, once carved by generations of hunters, had vanished beneath snow that came too soon and lingered too long. For the Neanderthals, each hunt had become a gamble against extinction, and failure was no longer a lesson, it was a death sentence. The mornings began in silence. The hunters no longer sang before they left the caves. There was no strength to waste on hope. Their breath clouded in the freezing air, their spears heavy in hands that had lost their certainty. Every movement carried the weight of hunger, every sound the risk of being heard by prey that had learned to fear them long before. The land had changed, and so had the rules. The great beasts they once stalked, the mammoths, the bison, the woolly rhinoceros, had moved north, far beyond the reach of tired legs and dwindling numbers. In their place came smaller, quicker creatures, and for hunters built for strength, not speed, the new prey offered only humiliation and exhaustion. The hunt was no longer a ritual of triumph but of desperation. Spears splintered against frozen ground, tips dulled by too many failures. The flint that once shattered cleanly now cracked unevenly, as if the earth itself resisted their touch. Each mistake cost them food, time, and lives. When a spear broke or a target fled, the silence that followed was not anger but despair, the heavy, quiet understanding that there would be less to eat tonight and fewer tomorrows left to chase. The old hunters, those who had once taught the young the secrets of the land, began to fall. Their bodies, once sculpted by decades of survival, grew thin and frail. The cold no longer respected experience. It crept into their bones, into their lungs, stealing warmth and memory alike. The young tried to carry on, but they lacked the endurance, the strength, the wisdom that had once defined their kind. They were born into scarcity, and scarcity shaped them poorly. The bloodline of giants was thinning into shadows. In the caves, the fires burned smaller, their light dimmer against the widening dark. Every meal was a reminder of how little remained. Bones were cracked for the last traces of marrow, hides patched and repatched until they fell apart in the cold. The rhythm of survival, once steady as a heartbeat, now stuttered and faltered. Even the earth seemed tired of their struggle. Yet still, they tried. The instinct to endure burned even when the body could not. They set their traps, they shaped their tools, they followed tracks through the snow that led only to emptiness. Theirs was not the failure of will, but of time. The world had changed too quickly, and they could not change with it. The ice that had once been their teacher had turned against them. It no longer forgave mistakes. Every misstep, every broken spear, every missed throw pushed them closer to silence. The strong grew fewer, the young weaker, and the once mighty lineage of Neanderthals began to fade into memory. In the endless white of the winter plains, their tracks filled with snow, and the wind carried away the sound of the last hunt, the sound of a species fighting, not to live, but simply to not be forgotten. The caves that once glowed with warmth and life now stood in stillness. The air inside was heavy and unmoving, thick with the scent of stone and forgotten fires. Where flames had once crackled, only ashes remained, fine gray dust scattered across the floor like the residue of vanished breath. The walls still bore the blackened traces of smoke, reaching upward as though trying to escape into a world that no longer listened. The silence that filled those hollow spaces was not peaceful. It was absolute, vast, and final. Once, These caverns had been sanctuaries. The heartbeat of fire had filled them with light, and the voices of the living had echoed softly beneath the dripping ceilings. The laughter of children had mixed with the crackle of flames, and the rhythm of tools striking bone had marked the passing of countless days. Each hearth told a story. Each stone remembered the press of hands. But now, those same stones had turned cold. The echoes of the past lingered faintly, like ghosts carved into the walls, slowly fading beneath layers of time and dust. Outside, the wind roamed freely, sweeping snow into the cave mouths, as if the earth itself sought to reclaim them. The footprints that once led home now led nowhere, disappearing beneath silt and frost. The animals that had once avoided the scent of humans now wandered freely into these empty chambers, sniffing at the remnants of a vanished people. Even the fire pits, once sacred centers of life, had collapsed inward, their stones scattered like the bones of an extinguished heart. The silence spoke louder than any voice. It carried the memory of what had been lost not through sound, but through absence. Every missing sound told a story. The quiet where breathing should have been, the stillness where the rustle of furs once marked movement, the hollow air where once there had been speech, laughter, and song. The Neanderthal world had not ended in a single moment. It had faded. Slowly. Gently. Like a candle burning itself out. Perhaps one or two lingered a little longer in the shadows of these caves, trying to hold on to a rhythm that no longer existed. Perhaps they tended small fires for as long as they could, whispering to the darkness out of habit rather than hope. But even they would have felt the pull of stillness, the weight of solitude pressing closer each night. The earth had already decided their fate. Overhead, icicles hung like glass teeth, dripping into the dust with the patience of centuries. Each drop marked time the way a heartbeat once did. Outside, the world continued without them. The forests thickened, the rivers changed their course, and the newcomers' fires burned where the Neanderthals once had. The cycle of life had not stopped, it had simply moved on. In the quiet of those caves, something ancient ended, and something unseen began. The last traces of the Neanderthal ashes, tools, bones, became part of the soil that would feed the future. Their silence was not just absence, it was transformation. The laughter that once filled those walls still echoes in us, faint but eternal. For though their voices are gone, their memory breathes in every human fire that burns against the dark. They moved quietly through the thinning forests, no longer a people but fragments of one. The Neanderthals who remained wandered in small, scattered bands, bound together by memory more than strength. The earth beneath their feet had changed. Soft where it was once hard. Green where it had once been white. The snow still came. But it melted sooner now, leaving behind mud and silence. The great herds that had once fed them were gone, the trails that once guided them erased by new rivers and encroaching trees. They searched for the old valleys, the open plains where the mammoths had moved like living mountains. But those places no longer existed. The land had turned its face away. Each day was a search for what was lost. They followed tracks that led nowhere, hunted animals that no longer came in numbers large enough to sustain them. They still built fires, though smaller now, careful not to waste the wood. The warmth that once gathered whole families together now flickered before only a few faces. Around those faint flames, they remembered the ones who had come before the elders, whose knowledge had died with them, the children who had not survived the hunger years. They remembered the valleys by name, though no one dared to speak them aloud, as if the sound itself would break something sacred. The forest felt unfamiliar, filled with the voices of birds they did not know, with trees that blocked the long view of the horizon. The Neanderthals had always belonged to the open, to the frozen winds and endless skies. But this new world was tight, closed, full of shadows. It was not made for them. They moved through it as ghosts might, seen by none, heard by few. Every day their numbers grew smaller. Some vanished into the cold, some into hunger, some simply into the quiet acceptance that they had reached the end of their long road. Yet even as the world turned against them, there was no hatred in their hearts. The Neanderthals did not curse the earth that betrayed them. They had lived too long in its rhythm to forget its balance. They knew that all things must change, and they felt their place within that truth. To them, the fading of their kind was not punishment, it was the closing of a story that had already been written in the bones of time. Still, memory clung like frost. They carried it with them in their tools, in their gestures, in the fire they refused to let die. Each strike of flint against stone was a whisper of the old world. Each meal shared beneath the trees a tribute to the ones who had walked before. They had no words for legacy, yet they lived it in every act of endurance. As the last bands drifted farther apart, the distance between them became more than miles, it became eras. A few would make it to the northern coasts, a few to the deep valleys, where they would watch the final winter rise. When they looked to the sky, they would see the same stars that had guided their ancestors. But even those stars seemed dimmer now, colder, as if the heavens themselves mourned their passing. The Neanderthals did not vanish in a single moment of tragedy. They faded like the last embers of a long fire, glowing faintly until the wind carried them away. Their end was not defeat but return to the earth that had made them, to the soil that would cradle their bones, to the silence that had always been waiting. The old names, though unspoken, remained in the stones and rivers. The world would remember them, even if no one else could. The river was not wide, but it was merciless. It wound through the melting forest like a scar, fed by the retreating glaciers that bled their last breath into the valleys below. Its surface shimmered in the pale spring light, hiding a current that moved with quiet fury. For the few Neanderthals who still wandered this land, the river marked a boundary not of territory, but of time itself. On one side lay the fading memory of all they had been, on the other, the uncertain promise of a world that no longer belonged to them. They had crossed many rivers before, following the trails of the herds that once gave them life. But now, the herds were gone, and they crossed only to keep moving, as if motion itself could hold back the truth of their extinction. The air was heavy with the scent of thawing earth and decay. Trees leaned over the banks, their roots clawing at the mud, their reflections trembling in the restless water. It was the season of melting, the season of endings. When they stepped into the river, the cold bit through skin and muscle like a blade. The current pulled at their legs, tugging with invisible hands. They moved slowly, carefully, their breaths shallow, their eyes fixed on the opposite shore. But the river was stronger than memory, stronger than flesh. It caught two of them, one old, one young, and carried them away without ceremony. There was no cry for help, no rush to follow. The others only stood, watching, as the figures disappeared into the distance, swallowed by foam and silence. No one went after, not because they did not care, but because there was nothing left to give. In that moment, they understood what the earth had been trying to tell them, that survival was no longer their story to tell. The water took more than bodies that day. It took names, voices, and histories. It carried away the last pieces of a people who had once ruled the ice, leaving only ripples that would vanish before the next sunrise. On the far bank, the survivors built no fire. They sat in the fading light, the damp air clinging to their skin, and stared into the trees that waited before them. The forest was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, the cry of strange birds, but none of it belonged to them. The world had already begun to forget. The river flowed on, unburdened by what it had taken. It did not remember the feet that had once crossed it or the lives it had swept away. Its purpose was not cruelty, only continuation. It would feed new grass, new forests, new life. The same water that ended one story would nourish another. That was the way of the earth, indifferent, eternal, and just. When night came, the river turned black beneath the stars. The wind carried no echo of the lost, only the steady whisper of moving water. It was the sound of time itself, erasing as it flowed. And though the Neanderthals did not know the words for it, they felt its truth deep within their bones. Some journeys have no return. The current does not stop for memory. And the world does not wait for those who cannot change. By morning, the footprints on the bank were already gone, washed clean by the rising water. The river kept its secret, and the earth moved on, leaving behind the faintest trace of a people who had once walked beside giants, now carried forever into the endless flow of forgetting. The storm came without warning. The air thickened first, heavy with a tension that even the animals could feel. The birds vanished from the trees, the wind stilled, and for a long moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the first thunder rolled across the plain, deep and distant, like the voice of the earth itself. The clouds gathered, dark and immense, folding over one another until the sky was swallowed in black. Lightning tore through the heavens, searing the horizon with veins of fire. For days, it did not stop. The rain began as a whisper, then became a roar. It struck the ground with such force that the rivers swelled beyond their banks, devouring everything in their path. Trees split in half, their roots wrenched from the soil. The plains, once a stretch of calm grass and scattered stones, transformed into a sea of mud and chaos. The earth shuddered beneath the endless thunder, and the sky blazed with a fury that no creature could stand against. The Neanderthals had faced winters that lasted years, but this storm was different. It was not the steady cruelty of ice, but the sudden violence of change. The wind carried heat instead of cold, sparks instead of snow. Lightning struck the forests, and fires spread faster than the rain could smother them. The night glowed with flames that turned the clouds red, while the rivers below boiled with the runoff of ash and molten soil. For those who still lived, the world became unrecognizable. They huddled in what shelter they could find, their fires drowned by the deluge, their food washed away. The thunder never ceased. It echoed through the valleys and across the mountains, a constant reminder that the sky itself had turned against them. When the rain finally weakened, the earth was no longer the same. The rivers had changed their course, carving new scars into the land. The forests that had offered food and shelter were gone, reduced to charred skeletons of wood. When the last rumble of thunder faded, silence fell across the valley, an unnatural, hollow silence. The smell of ash hung in the air, thick and choking. The ground steamed where the fires had burned hottest. No birds sang, no insects stirred, and the wind that returned carried only the scent of destruction. The survivors stepped out from their hiding places and looked upon a world that had been reborn in ruin. What the cold had not taken, the storm had claimed. The land that had once sustained them now bore no promise, only scars. Yet even in this devastation, there was a strange stillness, a sense of inevitability. The storm had not come to destroy alone, it had come to erase what was old, to make way for what was new. Nature, as always, was not cruel. It was indifferent. In the distance, smoke still rose from the blackened hills, twisting into the dawn like the ghosts of a dying age. The Neanderthals would walk through this as they had walked through everything else, quiet, enduring, carrying the memory of what once was. But something deep within the earth had shifted. The storm had not only changed the land, it had marked the final divide between those who would remain and those who would fade. When the rain finally stopped, the valley lay silent beneath a sky washed clean of fire. The clouds drifted apart, revealing stars that had not been seen in weeks. The air was clear, but the silence was heavier than before. It was the silence of ending the moment after the storm, when even the earth seems to mourn what it has lost. And in that quiet, the last echoes of thunder rolled away into the distance, leaving only ash, emptiness, and the faint memory of a world that had once belonged to giants. The final winter came quietly, like a slow closing of the sky. The snow began earlier than usual, drifting down in thick, unending waves until the world disappeared beneath white. Days lost their color. Nights lost their warmth. Even the air seemed to move slower, each breath hanging frozen before falling away. The cold was no longer just a season, it had become the shape of time itself. In the last valleys where the Neanderthals still clung to life, the world had grown small. The herds had vanished, the rivers were locked under ice, and the forests stood silent, stripped of their leaves and sound. The great plains that had once fed them for generations were now wastelands of frost and wind. The few who remained, families bound not by blood but by survival, had gathered in one final shelter, a cave carved by the patience of the earth. It was deep and dark, its entrance choked with snow, its heart dimly lit by a single trembling fire. The flames barely reached the walls, and what little light they gave flickered like a fading memory. The smoke crawled upward, tracing black veins along the ceiling where older fires had burned long ago. The walls still bore the marks of hands and soot, reminders of ancestors who had lived here in stronger times. But now the echoes of those days had vanished, replaced by the steady whisper of wind outside and the faint crackle of burning wood. Their tools lay beside them, dulled and worn. Spears splintered. Stones that once cut cleanly now broke unevenly, their edges blunted by years of use. There was little left to hunt, and less strength to hunt it. Every motion cost more than it gave. Every breath was an act of endurance. The Neanderthals had always been shaped by struggle, but this struggle had no rhythm, no mercy, and no end. They shared the last of their warmth as the storm raged outside. The air inside the cave shimmered faintly with the heat of their bodies, but the cold pressed closer, relentless and alive. The sound of the wind grew into a roar, filling every space that silence had left behind. Beyond the cave mouth, the snow rose higher, burying the entrance in drifts so thick that even the light of the moon could not pierce them. For hours, perhaps days, they waited. Time had lost its meaning long ago. The sun, when it rose, was a dull blur behind clouds. They no longer expected spring. They no longer expected rescue. What they waited for was not survival, but rest. Theirs had been a world of endurance, and they had endured longer than any should have. But now the fire that had carried them through thousands of winters had grown too small to fight the darkness. The last embers glowed red, then orange, then faint gold. The cave filled with shadows. The cold seeped in through stone, through skin, through bone. In that fading light, the final Neanderthals held one another, not in fear, but in recognition. They had reached the end of their story. The snow outside fell thicker still, wrapping the earth in silence. When the storm passed, the world was blank, pure, endless, and still. Morning came, though there was no one left to greet it. The fire had gone out. The cave lay quiet. The prints of their feet, their tools, their warmth, all gone beneath the snow. Yet the world did not forget them. Beneath that frozen earth, their bones remained, waiting for the sun to return, waiting to tell the story of a people who stood against the cold until the very last spark of their fire had died. When the storm finally broke, the world it left behind was unrecognizable. The sky cleared with a pale, distant light, and the sun rose over a land stripped bare of life. The snow lay deep and untouched, glistening like powdered glass beneath the morning light. No tracks marked its surface, no sound broke its stillness. The wind moved gently through the valleys, whispering across the drifts, its voice the only remnant of what had once been a living world. The Neanderthals were gone. Where once there had been fire, there was now only frost. The caves that had sheltered generations stood open and silent, their walls blackened by the smoke of fires long extinguished. The hearths were filled with cold ash, the bones of ancient hunts buried beneath layers of snow. The air that once carried the scent of wood smoke and life now smelled only of stone and emptiness. Every trace of their presence, every step, every tool, every echo of laughter had been erased by the patient hand of winter. The valleys seemed larger now, as though the land itself had expanded in their absence. The rivers that had once guided them still flowed beneath sheets of ice, winding through the plains as they always had, indifferent to who walked their banks. The mountains, too, remained, their peaks hidden behind curtains of cloud, watching over a world that no longer remembered its oldest children. Nature had reclaimed what had been borrowed, and it had done so without hesitation or sorrow. Time began to move differently. Without fire, without speech, without memory, The land fell back into its own rhythm. The wind became the storyteller now, carrying fragments of the past through the empty forests. It whispered through the hollows of the caves, over the bones that slept beneath the frost, telling a story only the earth could hear. In the hush of that new dawn, it was as if the Neanderthals had never been at all. But the world does not forget completely. The bones that rested beneath the snow were more than remains. They were reminders. They held within them the record of endurance, of countless winters survived, of hands that shaped stone and kept the first fires alive. Though their bodies had vanished from the living world, their presence lingered in the soil, in the rivers, in the quiet persistence of life that followed. Every bird that nested in the cliffs, every blade of grass that grew from the thawed ground, was touched by what they had left behind. The dawn that rose over their empty valleys was not cruel. It was calm, almost tender, as if the world itself paused to honor what had passed. The snow shimmered under the soft light, a shroud both beautiful and final. For 300,000 years, the Neanderthals had endured. They had learned the secrets of fire, the patterns of the stars, the language of the earth. They had sung without words and loved without promise. They had lived completely within the circle of nature, and when the circle closed, they returned to it. As the light grew stronger, the wind began to fade, leaving the land in perfect stillness. The last traces of the storm drifted away, and the sky above turned clear and blue. The world was quiet again, but not empty. The Neanderthals' time had ended. Yet their story remained written in the earth itself, waiting for those who would one day uncover it. The dawn without them was not an ending. It was a beginning, the first morning of a world that would carry their memory forward, even if it no longer knew their name. The world was quiet when they came. The storms had ended, the snow had begun to melt, and the valleys, once heavy with silence, waited for new footsteps. Across the plains, the newcomers spread like spring after a long winter. They followed the rivers, settled near the cliffs, and built their fires in the same places where Neanderthals once warmed their hands. The land did not resist them. It accepted them as it had accepted all who came before, indifferent to who lived and who vanished. These new humans, lighter in frame but restless in spirit, filled the emptiness left behind. They gathered in groups that grew larger with every passing generation. They spoke in voices more varied and musical, their words rising like birdsong over the open fields. They shaped tools finer than any the world had yet seen, small blades and needles that shimmered in the sunlight. Their fires burned longer, their shelters reached wider, and their hunger to explore drove them farther than any creature had ever dared. They found the caves without knowing what they were. The soot-stained walls told no story to them, only hinted at a mystery too old to understand. They laid their furs on the same stone floors where another kind of human had once slept. Their laughter echoed against the same walls that had once held whispers of the old language, the language of glances and gestures. They did not know they were walking among ghosts. The plains that had once belonged to the Neanderthals bloomed again under the touch of the newcomers. Herds returned, following new migration routes. The forests grew thicker, and where the old fires had turned the soil to ash, green life now pushed through. The new people hunted with strategy and communication, surrounding their prey, planning their kills. They built tools from bone, flint, and antler, creating weapons that carried reach and precision. Theirs was not a life of endurance, but of expansion. Everywhere they went, they left signs of permanence, marks of their existence that time could not so easily erase. The first villages formed along the riverbanks, clusters of huts made from branches, hides, and stone. They learned to preserve food, to store it for seasons when the land turned cruel. Their fires did not die out when the wind came. They fed them, shielded them, kept them alive. In their warmth, a new kind of future was being born. And yet, in the stillness of night, when the flames burned low and shadows danced against the stone, the air seemed to remember. The caves whispered faintly, as if the old spirits still lingered there, unseen but present. The newcomers felt it too, though they could not explain it, a strange weight in the air, a chill that came without reason. The earth does not forget easily, and these places had seen too much to be silent. The age of the others had begun, though they never knew it came at a cost. Their triumphs were built on the echoes of another species, their footprints layered over the ones that came before. The Neanderthals had vanished, but their story did not end. It had simply been absorbed into the greater song of humankind. Their strength lived on in blood and instinct, in the memory of fire, in the unspoken bond that tied all humans to the earth. As dawn spread across the plains, the newcomers thrived. Their children laughed, their fires glowed, and their voices filled the air once more. The land was alive again, but it was changed forever. The world had turned a page, and though the old chapter was gone, its ashes fed the soil from which the new one grew. And so the Neanderthals remained, not as bones in the frost, but as whispers carried within those who unknowingly inherited their place beneath the same eternal sky. In the end, it was not a battle that ended them. No great cataclysm swept across the plains, no plague tore through their kind. The Neanderthals did not fall to the sword or the spear. They did not vanish in fire, but in silence. Their extinction was not an explosion, but a whisper. It came softly, like the fading glow of embers after a long night, a slow and quiet surrender to time. The earth they once ruled simply moved on without them. Their end began not with death, but with absence. One winter, fewer fires burned across the valleys. One spring, fewer tracks marked the riversides. A generation passed, and their voices grew faint, their presence scattered among the stones and bones of forgotten shelters. They did not know they were the last. How could they? For 300,000 years, they had endured every change the world threw upon them. They had faced the endless ice, the hunger years, the storms that shook the earth, and had always survived. But survival is not immortality. Even the strongest flame, if untended, will dim. Their bloodline merged quietly into others. The newcomers who came after them carried fragments of their story, tiny echoes written into flesh and bone. A brow shape here, a rhythm of strength there, a memory buried deep in the genome. The Neanderthals did not vanish completely. They became part of what followed. Yet their world, the one carved from cold and silence, was gone forever. The earth healed where they had walked, the snow melted, and grass grew where their footprints once marked the ground. The caves filled with dust, their walls softening with time. The rivers that once reflected their faces carried new reflections, now those of a younger, restless species, who would one day name the world but never truly own it. The Neanderthals' fires went out one by one, each leaving behind a ring of ash, a handful of stone, and the faint scent of smoke that time would scatter into nothing. And yet, not all traces were lost. Sometimes, in the dark stillness of an ancient cave, the past seems to breathe again. A flicker of light touches the walls, and for a moment, the soot-dark ceiling seems to move. It is easy to imagine them there still, watching from the edges of memory, broad faces illuminated by flame, heavy eyes reflecting something both fierce and gentle. Theirs was not a tragic end, only a natural one. They had given everything the earth had asked of them, and when the time came, they stepped quietly into the long night of history. But history is a poor keeper of souls. It forgets the quiet people first, those who leave no monuments, no cities, no words. The Neanderthals left only the things that mattered most: the warmth of fire, the touch of family, the will to endure. These gifts became the inheritance of the species that followed, the foundation of all that would come after. Every human fire that burns today is an echo of theirs. Every story told beside its glow carries their unspoken memory. If you listen closely to the crackle of flame, you might still hear them, the hum of breath against stone, the whisper of movement in the dark. They are not gone, not truly. They live in the warmth we seek, in the light we guard, in the persistence that defines us. The fire that once burned in their hands burns still in ours. It has crossed the ages, dimmed but unbroken, fragile yet eternal. And as the last spark fades into smoke, the world remains quiet for a moment longer, as if holding its breath in reverence. The night accepts their silence, the stars bear witness, and the earth keeps their story. The Neanderthals are gone, but their fire, though faint, still flickers in every human heart. It is the fire that never truly dies, the fire that remembers,